Recently, I've received a number of messages asking if I could paint a little beach scene, and it's something I've wanted to do for a long time, but I've recently introduced this new series to the channel, which is the 10-minute paintings, and a beach, it has a lot going on. There are a lot of intricacies within waves, and the way you have to blend the sky. There are a couple of things you have to do. So I knew that I couldn't do it in 10 minutes, and today's video, because of that, is going to be done in about 15. So to begin, I'm using this large round-headed brush. I'm using a mixture of primary yellow, a little bit of primary red, and a good amount of titanium white, and I'm creating this little gradient emanating from a sun, which I'll have down there at the bottom. I've just moved it out to have more of my yellows around the sun, and then it gets a little bit orange around the top. From there, I'm grabbing a square-headed brush, and I'm just applying a very grayed down blue to the top of my sky, and I'm leaving a little area in between the orange and the blue. Then, here, you can see that I'm going in and I'm filling that in with a complete gray. There is no blue in this mixture, there is no orange. And I'm doing that so that I don't have the blue touching the yellow that's mixed in with the orange, because the two of them would make a real green, and by putting the gray in between the yellow and the blue, it really dissipates what I'm doing. You can also add a pink to further work with this, but because I'm short on time, I thought that was a fair little compromise. You can still see a little bit of green, but had we not used that strip of gray in the middle, it would have been so much more prominent. So with that being said, I'm taking my medium-sized square-headed brush from Artist's Loft. I used that for the blue, by the way, just because I wanted to work concisely, and I'm working in some clouds. Now this brush is fantastic for clouds because it can render a sharp edge if you want, and it can hold a lot of paint. By working in a round circular motion like this, I can also soften things, such as the edges, as you can see, and you get this very subtle blend back into the canvas. It's only doing this because the canvas is still a little bit wet, both from the clouds that we are now implying and from the initial background. So you have to do it within a certain amount of time, but if you do miss that period of time, don't worry about it. Just add a little bit more water and it will really help the viscous nature of the paint and getting those very smooth gradients from one color to another. So from there, I'm just trying to really find the color I want in these clouds. So I add a little bit of very light purple, then I add some additional black, and I'm ending up with something fairly gray. And I'm actually very happy with that. I don't want the clouds to take away from the sunset or from the main wave I'm doing. I want them to be a little bit more subdued, and I think that's actually a really important lesson. When you're doing a painting, don't make everything hyper saturated, hyper vibrant, hyper sharp, hyper complicated. Save those things for the main focus, that main area in the painting you really want the viewer's eye to go to. And it will go to that area because it'll just have so much more going on. So we have a very subtle sky, very subtle clouds, and again, this is just going to help ensure that the viewer's eye is directed where we want it. So from there, I'm using that same square-headed brush. It's a very versatile brush. I'm rendering very sharp edges for my mountains with it, and I'm using a mixture of orange that I used in the sky and the purple that I used in the sky as well. On the sides of the mountains that are not facing the sun, I'm incorporating a little bit more black, as you can see, and this is just going to darken it and ensure that they are three-dimensional objects and shapes within this landscape. You really want all of your landscape, your mountains, your trees, your rocks, everything, to be affected by the light, and the light is going to make it three-dimensional. So as you can see now, the sides of the mountains that are facing the sun are much brighter, and they are still subdued. Much like the clouds, this is in the background, this is in the distance. This isn't really where I want my viewers' attention to go to. So again, you want to ensure that this is an area that's a little less rendered, a little bit less finished than the rest of the painting. So don't ever worry about that. Don't worry about, not getting the background completely right, because sometimes that really can actually help the painting itself. So from there, I'm taking a burnt umber and I'm applying it to the foreground here, the corner of my painting, and this is going to be the sand. It also has a little bit of titanium white mixed in there, just to make it a little bit more thick and to brighten it up a little bit. Then I'm taking I believe primary blue, and with that same brush, we're still using that same square-headed brush, I'm just blocking in where I want all of my water to be. So here I'm also taking some titanium white, and in very jagged motions, moving backwards and forwards, I'm moving it on top of my ground area here. And as you can see, it's blending in with a lot of the brown, which is fantastic, because now it looks like the ground is wet and it has varying levels of water on top of it. The more you do of this, the more of that effect you'll render, and you can actually go back and work on it, and that's what I do. But here I'm just kind of roughly sketching in the shape of my wave, and that's another thing too. When you apply paint, you don't have to worry about getting it perfect. I know that a lot of people are kind of hesitant to paint because of that fear, and as you can see here, I'm just very roughly drawing with my paint. I can go back in, I can fix it, I can rework it, I can move it, I can add water to make it a little bit more wet and viscous so I can move it even more, and I'm not worried about messing up, because at this point I'm not really even completely sure what I want to do. So as you can see, this process, it's very rough. We're leaving a lot of that bottom of the wave undone, and I'm going to the top just to see how far I want the wave to crash down. So here I'm taking more just pure titanium white, and I'm having it kind of barrel over the top here. And as you can see, it blends in with the blue because it's also wet. So we're applying a pure white, but that isn't what ends up on the canvas. And that's important to recognize. The color you mix on your palette isn't always going to be the color that you see on the canvas, because it's going to blend to a point. And some colors are actually transparent to a point, so that's something to keep in mind as well. So now that I have the background blocked in, I'm going back with my square-headed brush, and I'm just creating more of these little barreled shapes over the edge of this little wave here. I'm also creating more of those barrel shapes at the bottom. You see we have it both at the top and the bottom. And this is really going to give it a cylindrical look, cylindrical effect. So it looks like if you were to take a tube and cut it in half, this is essentially what you'd have. And we're putting lines almost from one end to the other. And these curved lines, as you can see, really act as something that makes it much more three-dimensional. So, as we mentioned, the initial application was very rough, so I'm having to go back and rework on a lot of this middle of the wave area, and that's completely fine. I'm just letting that dry for a second and going back to the farther water and creating a couple more of these waves. But because it's much farther away, I'm being much more loose with my strokes. I'm not trying to add all of that detail. I'm not trying to make it very vibrant or very bright in value. Because again, it's in the background, it's in the distance, and it's not where I want my viewer's eye to go to. I want it in the foreground, or I want it on the sun. And so we can really help ensure that happens by, again, muting everything that's going on not in those areas. So now that a better portion of my foreground has dried, I'm taking more of that titanium white, and I'm creating even more of those lines that drift in between the sand and the water. As you can see, the sand is still a little bit wet, and so I'm moving that brown back up there, and that's great because it looks like the wave is grabbing some of it and it's bringing it back up into the water, moving it in and out, and it just makes a much more realistic effect. So from there I'm taking a primary blue, and this is just a little bit of black and a little bit of white. It's very dark, and I'm applying that almost to the base of my water here. That area is going to be a little bit darker, as is the portion right before the overlap of the water. So really the brightest areas of the wave are going to be the very top, the very bottom, and then the middle is going to be kind of bright, with the two areas in between a little bit darker. And I know that might seem a little bit complicated, but don't really worry about it. I'm sure it's something you'll naturally figure out when you're working on it. It's very intuitive, and again, just don't worry. But another way to think about it is the light, it's passing through the wave, and it's really going to shine on the top, right? But that middle portion, it's very thin, so more light's going to come through it, and so it's going to be a little bit brighter as well. With that being said, I'm just applying more little touch-ups, I'm reworking things around, and I'm just trying to figure out exactly what I want to do. Now that the top of my waves is a little bit more dry, I'm going back in with a titanium white and a very small square-headed brush, and I'm applying more additional detail to that water that's just kind of falling. As you can see, we are moving our way across the wave, and I'm trying to make sure that all of my strokes are a little bit different from the one next to them. The more diversity in your strokes, the better your painting will be, the more natural it will look. You'll also notice that the wave itself isn't completely straight, it's a little bit changing, jagged, and that also really helps make it just interesting in that way. So from there I'm taking a gray with a very large round-headed brush, and I'm just applying that over portions of my mountain. And this is kind of the clouds coming down, maybe it's a mist or a fog, and it's just concealing some of that background. This is just to make it even more subtle, more subdued, more muted, to ensure that, again, the eye does go to the foreground in the painting. And it's also a great lesson to show you again that you don't have to finish every area of the painting immediately to move on. Sometimes you have to wait for things to dry, or you have to wait to see how other portions of it look. You have to balance it. So don't get discouraged at the start of your painting if the background and the sky isn't the way you wanted, because again, it should be a little bit muted, and it should be something you can come back to later. And so just don't ever fear that sort of thing. Enjoy painting. It is meant to be a fun process. So with all of that being said, I am still working on the middle of the wave and the bottom portion here. I'm just taking more of the blues and the whites and moving them around, and it's slowly turning into something I like. But I really put emphasis on the word slowly because that is accurate. And even in these 10 and 15 minute paintings, you know, it's crazy to think that it'll just happen like magic, like that. It does take some time, it does take some thought, but in the end, I think it's worth it, and I think we all come out with something that we, if not really enjoy, we enjoy the process of doing. So with that being said, here we're really getting into the detail work, and I love this portion. Sometimes it feels like that last 5 to 10% of the painting is what really makes it come together, and that's definitely the case here. I'm thinning the final strokes here with a lot of water, and so you get these very soft blends from the bottom of the wave going up to the top. Then I'm taking that same color, and it's because I ran out of time, but I would have taken a color that's a little more similar to the sky, and I'm just applying highlights to the bottom of the clouds up there. Again, this is something we could have done at the start of the painting, but I thought it was better to wait and see how the rest of the painting progressed to see if we could allow for this additional level of detail. It also adds to a cohesive nature of the painting because it is the same color as the bottom. And there we have it. The finished painting, I did do an extra 2 or 3 minutes as I usually do, but I'm very happy with this. I think it was a lot of fun. I hope you learned something, and if you enjoyed this, if you'd like to see more, again, hit that subscribe button. I post every Saturday, and I hope to see you next Saturday. Thank you so much for watching.